Let's check in now on the race for Washington's governor. Yes, Southwest Washington, we're thinking about you. The primary is in 3 months in August, but the filing deadline was last Friday, and this weekend things got a little confusing there when 3 people named Bob Ferguson filed to run for governor. Not kidding. You're probably familiar with the first Bob Ferguson, Bob Watson Ferguson. He's been the Attorney General in Washington since 2013, and he announced his campaign for governor back in September of last year. But then another Bob Ferguson jumped into the race at the 11th hour last Friday. He's a U.S. Army veteran from Graham, Washington. His full name is Bob Benjamin Ferguson. Then a third Bob Ferguson, a man named Bob Arthur Ferguson from Yakima, also filed to run for governor also on Friday. They all 3 filed to run as Democrats. That's a little confusing, huh? The Washington State Standard, that's a news outlet, reports that the 2 new Bobs were a scheme devised by conservative Republican activist Glenn Morgan. Morgan apparently contacted 53 different Washington residents named Bob Ferguson to try and recruit them to run for governor. These 2 agreed. Neither has any political experience, and Morgan paid the $1,900 filing fee for them. Now, the original Bob Ferguson, the Attorney General Bob Ferguson, was not amused. He had his campaign lawyers send a cease and desist letter to the other 2 Bobs over the weekend, letting them know they could actually go to jail for running for governor with the same name as him, even though it's their legal name. The conservative activist Glenn Morgan posted a video on YouTube about it.
Any resident and voter of Washington State, whatever name they have, should be able to run for political office. Both of these candidates had campaign plans and platforms that they were working on, silenced now forever under duress and threats of arrest by the highest law enforcement officer in the state of Washington.
It is an interesting situation. If the 2 new Bobs had campaign plans, though, they weren't posted on their websites, and their sites have now been taken down. So put us down as doubtful. Attorney General Bob Ferguson held a press conference Monday calling on the other Bobs to drop out of the race and saying that they were a threat to democracy.
Their goal is clear: to mislead voters and split my supporters 3 ways to depress my vote total and keep me from moving into the top 2 in the general election.
Ferguson said that if the other Bobs didn't drop out, he'd ask the Secretary of State to change up the way the ballot appears. He said he wanted the candidates to be called Robert Ferguson on the ballot and have him be the only Bob, and to have them have their middle names and occupations listed as well. He also wanted his name moved up.
After the drawing of straws on Friday afternoon, one of these Bob Fergusons will appear second on the ballot. The other will appear third on the ballot, and I appear number 13 on the ballot. Look, anyone who has any knowledge of campaigns knows that in a ballot with 30 names, as Dan mentioned, all sorts of studies show that many voters don't get past the first few names. And what I would say is, if the ballot order remains unchanged, there is no question that thousands of Washingtonians will think they're voting for me, and they'll really be voting for these other 2 individuals. That's just a fact. That is going to happen.
Well, not anymore. Bob Ferguson's number 1 campaign threatened Bob Ferguson number 2 and Bob Ferguson number 3 with prosecution, citing an 80-year-old Washington state law which makes it a felony to file for an office with the same name as someone whose political reputation is widely known, with intent to confuse and mislead the electors. That worked out pretty well, huh? Very specific. It did work. The other 2 Bobs said, okay, we're out, and they dropped out. They posted statements on their short-lived campaign websites. Bob Ferguson from Graham said he was withdrawing under duress and with a heavy heart. And he said, after my candidacy was announced, I was faced with harassment and legal action if I did not withdraw from the race. I was publicly labeled a threat to democracy. And in a typical hypocritical fashion, this other candidate's actions are a true threat to democracy. Well, that wasn't all. Bob Ferguson from Yakima said that it was the second worst day of his life. He wrote, "A dream of mine was destroyed. I realized my campaign would appear to be like an ant running against a bulldozer, but I always thought that we lived in a free country where anyone could run for public office no matter how much an underdog they were." Now, there are 28 candidates in total running for governor in Washington state, but there's only one Bob Ferguson. His name will appear 11th on the ballot.